I really do want to jump over to San Francisco, though. You mentioned them. That's who we picked for the NFC West. A lot of fun teams in that division as well. But this is a team where, with the expected quarterback change, with the talent at the top, it's pretty undeniable that Deebo Samuel's going later than he otherwise would just because of the quarterback change. I mean, he's going sort of mid-second. Probably would have been a first-round pick if, say, Garoppolo was back. Kittle definitely is. I guess that one's more undeniable. I mean, he's going into like the 5th round, I think, in a draft I was in last night. Aiyuk is, still getting some love, but not really being steamed up. We had this discussion last year. How could all three of these guys coexist in an offense where Lance was expected to play more than he did? And the answer was sort of that they didn't really. I mean, Deebo absolutely smashed. Aiyuk didn't play a ton early. Kittle had some injury issues, didn't really have, a dominant season. But what we saw out of Lance was an 86 drop back sample. And his scramble rates and his design run rates were massive in that sample. Very, very small sample. But I've already done my projection for this team. And when I looked at them, number one, the first thing obviously that stands out, you look at their pass rate over expected. You look at some of those elements. This is a run-heavy team. Kyle Shanahan calls a run-heavy game. Regardless sort of who's been at quarterback, they're going to call more run plays. Then you look at some of the other rushing quarterbacks. You look at Lamar, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Kyler, Justin Fields. A lot of those guys, and especially the ones that have played 3 or 4 years now, Lamar and Allen, Kyler, their scramble rates and their design run rates maybe were a little heavier than they were once they got a little more settled as passers into like their third seasons, right? So we see that, and we see that with the raw rush rates typically, that the running quarterbacks are going to run a little more really early in their career. Lance, especially as a guy who didn't look comfortable as a passer last year, and you noted some of the stuff from college where he didn't even throw a lot in their national championship game. He was heavily leaned on for his rushing in college, has incredible athleticism and for his size, has sort of like a Cam Newton or Josh Allen type of element to him where it's tough to bring down as well, and could just be an incredible runner. I think there's a pretty strong case could be in that mold where his rush rates, his designed run rates, that Kyle Shanahan might be, if Lance is in there for 17 games this year, might be more comfortable leaning on him to run the ball in certain spots than to drop back to throw, especially you start talking about the red zone and places like that. Looking at the rates that the other mobile quarterbacks have had, Lance far beyond that, very small sample last year. But even when you really like nuke his scramble rates and his design run rates, with this offense already being pretty run heavy, I had an incredibly hard time limiting how much rushing I would put for Lance. And one of the things that I think we don't do enough when we talk about the mobile quarterbacks is sort of the degree of their mobility. It's easy to just be like, yeah, he adds that rushing element. But there are certain guys that 500 rush yards is like a really strong number. There were only 3 guys that hit 500 last year. They all hit 700. It was Hurts, Lamar, and Josh Allen. And no one had over 800 rush yards. Lamar had 1,000-yard rushing seasons in 2020 and 2019. He was the first quarterback to do that since Michael Vick. They're the only 2 to this point. Where I'm going with Trey Lance is that when I did their projection, having them pretty run heavy, looking at the rate at which I expect Lance might scramble when he does get called pass plays, at the rate at which they might call him at his number on design runs, especially if they don't want to use Deebo running as much anymore, which we know is a point of contention. They're going to use their running backs a ton, obviously. They're going to use Deebo some running the ball. But Lance having designed run plays is sort of part of the equation probably of Deebo's rush rate getting scaled back a little bit. As much as I really pushed his rushing numbers down from that small sample last year, I still wound up having him rush about 150 times, which is a huge number. There were only 3 quarterbacks who had 100 carries last year. None of them had 150. It's the 3 that I mentioned. in the last few years, it's basically only been Lamar who's been over 150 carries. And you go way back to 2019, his huge season. And a big part of that was his passing numbers, but he had 176 carries. I mean, it was way beyond everyone else. Josh Allen was second that year with 109 carries. So again, this degree to which his rushing could manifest. I mean, I wound up projecting Lance for 150 carries as a baseline, which with any kind of rushing efficiencies, like an 800-yard rushing season would have led the league last year at quarterback. This is assuming 17 games, and there is risk there for sure. But we're talking about, I mean, I think you can pretty easily justify him, like projecting him as a baseline rushing for even more than that. I was really cutting his rates. And if you're looking at their run heavy team and you're saying, I don't think they're going to trust Lance to throw a lot, they're going to call design rushes. He's also going to scramble as he struggles as a passer somewhat. He could be up around 200 carries. And if he's up around 200 carries, you're probably talking about close to a 1,000-yard rushing season. Most quarterbacks average about 5 yards per carry. You're probably talking about close to 10 rushing touchdowns with his size and the way that they might use him in the red zone. What's really interesting about that is just what it would mean, obviously, for Deebo and for Kittle and Aiyuk. Trying to put numbers to that is interesting. But also, you have to regress some of the efficiency on guys like Deebo, but they're going to create plays, and this offense is designed for yards after the catch. Again, like I still want to have exposure to Deebo and Kittle in them, but I just keep going back to Lance, where if they're making any plays after the catch or making any plays as a receiver, they're going to just be improving Lance's passing numbers as well, which might be low level if he runs as much as I'm sort of suggesting. But I came out of my projection for the Niners thinking that Trey Lance was a pretty clear pick at ADP. Somebody who's probably going to rise as people start talking about their projections as well. The only other time I've ever felt this way doing a projection where I felt like there was almost no cap on the quarterback's rushing was Lamar Jackson's second season. He had a very small sample in his rookie year as well, and mostly was coming in for some rushing packages and then played late that year and ran a lot. And it was like, man, you can really easily say if he's anywhere near these rushing rates that he's going to rush for 1,000 yards. And that's something that was very popular in the fantasy industry. And Lamar was a very popular late round QB for that reason. Now, again, big part of why he blew up in year two was the passing was huge. You look at like Jalen Hurts last year, great rushing numbers. Passing wasn't nearly as huge. And he was like QB 10. I mean, he was good. But to me, if Lance plays 17 games, that's sort of like the floor. I mean, you can't really get a lot lower passing numbers than Hurts had last year. Go back to Kyler's rookie year and Josh Allen's rookie year in 2019. Sort of similar, very low passing numbers, pretty strong rushing seasons. But like 500-yard rushing seasons, I'm saying Lance might have 800 yards rushing. I don't know. I mean, he's a tough one. If he plays the 17 games, the way that this offense is designed, I just don't see any scenarios where he's not a top 10 quarterback, and he's going about QB 10 right now.
Well, Ben, thanks for ruining that for all of us. I'm now on a long streak here of selecting Trey Lance in the 8th round of every draft. Every time I write it up, I say I think he's going much higher. Hopefully that's not the case, because while there is some risk, as you pointed out, the upside here is tantalizing. I mean, if he finished as the QB1 this season, I would not be remotely surprised. And part of that is because he has incredible weapons. Maybe the most controversial of the three players that you mentioned as the receiving stars is Brandon Aiyuk. And we all know that his season sort of turned on a dime last year. We're just kind of splitting it half and half, looking in the Stealing Signals tool. You can see that he had a 69% route percentage over the first 9 weeks. That jumps up to 92% from week 10 to week 18, where he easily led Samuel and Kittle, who were at 81 and 78 respectively. The interesting thing here, and we're talking about Deebo Samuel and just how dynamic and yet exasperatingly confusing his profile is. This is someone who not only did his route rate drop because he started to be used so heavily as a running back, but he actually had the 3rd ranked target per route during that stretch of those three guys. At 20% there, a little bit below Aiyuk at 21, and Kittle all the way up at 27. We know that he dealt with injuries last year. And then you mentioned the yards after the catch element that the 49ers offense is structured to create. All of these players were above 10 yards per target during that week 10 to week 18 range, when the 49ers really sort of came on, made their playoff push, almost get themselves back to the Super Bowl based on what they did then in the playoffs. But to think of all three of those guys being above 10 yards per target, despite the fact that the deepest any of the three was targeted was 10.1 yards down the field, that was Aiyuk. Again, you're talking about very good pass efficiency from Jimmy Garoppolo, then the run after the catch that all three of those players bring. They may be three of the top 10 or 15 guys in the entire NFL when it comes to what they can do with the ball in their hands. Deebo Samuel, we talk about all the other things that seem unsustainable about what he did last year and these crazy, insane touchdown rates, but he was at just a fraction under 13 yards per target over that second half of the season. The way that I like to play this is to play Deebo because he has this crazy talent. I think that he is right there with Cooper Kupp and the rising stars in Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase as the best wide receiver in the NFL. He's got so much variety in terms of what he can do that if there are some struggles in one area, I think they'll be balanced out in another. And yet, for the reasons that you said about how this run heavy offense could become even more so with Trey Lance scrambling on a lot of these plays that probably were supposed to be pass plays, in addition to just design runs for him because of what he brings to the table. Now, hopefully for those of us who are drafting the receivers, a lot of that will actually come out of Elijah Mitchell and the running backs. But you have this volume concern, and yet you have so many different ways it could play out in his favor, including if Aiyuk were to, for any reason, kind of regress and have some of those troubles he had in the first half of last year, or if Kittle has injuries as he's dealt with from time to time. The injury to one of the three players in this mix, I think, makes the other two guys elite. And one of the things that we've talked about, or heard at least the 49ers as they try and build Lance up, because there definitely are still some questions, is that his arm talent could unlock these guys down the field. And we know that Garoppolo wasn't really able to make those throws. And we also know that despite the fact that they're so good after the catch, that there is some vertical ability to these three guys as well. I mean, these are elite receiving options, the two receivers and the tight end. Kittle, as you mentioned, has gotten so inexpensive that you have to play him. Aiyuk is the one that, despite being the least expensive, I've had some troubles getting on board with, simply because those other two guys, I think, are just absolute superstars. But you can definitely make the argument for mixing him in as well, because he's in this area where we've talked about how maybe the wide receivers are not as compelling as they've been in past seasons. I think despite the traffic jam, it does make sense to draft these three players based on scenarios that would make them league winners. But we do want to, try and kind of work in as much price discipline as we can, because there are scenarios, especially I think over the first half of the season, as the 49ers are trying to make this work, where you may draft these three players and then be a month in and think, a little bit like we were with the Vikings a couple of years ago. We're like, are they going to throw any passes? Is this offense going to work for us? How do these scenarios I thought I saw in the preseason, how do they come to fruition?
Yeah, that's the way I felt when I was doing the projection. Is one of the ways that I looked at it, especially on the touchdown side with Deebo's massive rates. I mean, because if you're being this run heavy and you're projecting a lot of runs for Lance, it's almost impossible to project Deebo for the number of targets that you'd like to project him for. You can still give him some rushes, but obviously we know, and a good number of rushes. I gave him averaging 2 per game. There was a point where he was averaging significantly more than that, but we know that that's not what they necessarily want to do or what he wants to do. But 30 plus rushes is a lot for a receiver, and that's where I have him. But still, to look at his TD rates both as a rusher, like on a per rush basis, on a per target basis, they're wildly unsustainable, and yet I still projected him very high because I was looking at it from this context of the sort of the market share of TDs, which we talk about a lot with the prospects. I've seen some people incorporate that into their projections around the industry. I'm a pretty big fan of that. I think that makes a lot of sense, because when I think about it from that perspective, I'm thinking, okay, who's going to score for the Niners? They're projected to be an above average offense. It's another element that goes to Lance as well, right? That this is a team that's going to have, if you look at the Vegas lines, if you look at their projections throughout the year and all the other elements, they're a team that's going to have scoring opportunities. And who's going to score for them? Like, certainly the running backs are going to score a decent amount combined. Maybe that's split in various ways. I think that leaves a lot of opportunity for Lance to rush for a decent number of touchdowns. But also as it relates to Deebo, as it relates to Kittle, as it relates to Aiyuk, I wanted to make sure that basically their percent share of the touchdowns in the offense, even if I wasn't giving them a ton of targets, was reasonably high. Because if this offense does move the ball and is successful, even if they're running all over the field, when they get down into the red zone, they need to do different things. They're gonna put the ball in Deebo Samuel's hands one way or another at a decent amount of the time. And so I'm probably gonna wind up projecting him for higher touchdown rates than pretty much any other player in the league. And I think it's justifiable from that sense, where you can't wind up with a projection where just because you're so run heavy, the offense doesn't have enough touchdowns overall relative to what it's projecting for or looks like in the big picture in the Vegas markets. And I certainly don't want to be allocating all of those touchdowns just on the ground or to sort of inferior talents, when I do think that Deebo's probably going to be a guy that they rely on those key, high value touches, whether that is as a runner or using him in a jet motion tip pass way, which be receiver, or throwing him screens down in the red zone, different things that, or him creating big plays, right? Him creating after the catch and these long touchdowns that he had several of last year. Again, not sustainable, but doesn't mean he can't have a couple, or it really doesn't mean he can't repeat the rate at which he did it. It doesn't seem sustainable, but he's incredibly good. And so looking at it from that perspective, sort of the share of touchdowns, he had about 30% of their TDs as a team last year. I knocked that down, but I still have his TD rate to like 24%. I still have his TD rates incredibly high. And just put some numbers to the Lance stuff. His design run rate last year was 30%. Most of the quarterbacks are under 20%, even the scramblers. Lamar's big 2019 season, he went the entire season at about 29% design run rate. He was at 23% in 2020, down to about 17% last year. I moved Lance all the way down to a 17% design run rate because it is a very small sample where he was way up at 30%. But that's why I'm saying I could see him even break through the number that I'm projecting in terms of rush attempts, because it wouldn't be that surprising if, like Lamar in his first couple of years, Lance was getting design runs called on more than 20% of his dropbacks. And I feel like there's more room for him to beat that 17% number I just said, which is below Kyler Murray's, typical numbers. Or I think it's in the range of Kyler, but it's below Jalen Hurts, both of Jalen Hurts seasons. It's in the range of like Kyler and Josh Allen and some of these guys. There's still more room for Lance to beat that. So I agree with everything you said, though, in terms of how to play these players and some of the concerns, right? I mean, this is a really interesting offense. I do think the market has it right to be a little bit wary of overall volume, because we do see that. I mean, we saw that with the Eagles last year. It can still be a pretty good offense, and this Niners offense would probably be expected to be better than the Eagles. But when you have a guy like what Hurts was doing with the Eagles last year, running a lot, and the team is run heavy anyway, and Hurts was eating up a lot of the touchdowns in near the red zone, it's tough for the skill position guys to have the types of spike weeks and to have the types of overall volume for the season that when we look at over at San Francisco, that would justify where these ADPs are. So I guess probably the best way that I would put this from an actual perspective is I don't think this is an offense I really want to be like multiple, stacking multiple ways. I'm with you that there's a strong contingency based argument as well, where if Kittle or if Deebo misses time or if Aiyuk misses time, that things are going to concentrate to the other guys and they really have a lot of upside. But I don't know if I want to be making bets on like Deebo and Kittle on the same team, because I think some of their upside overlaps.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I think you can put them in there with Lance because a true tournament winning game from Lance is probably going to rest on him hitting a couple touchdowns through the air as well. But it would be hard to see both Samuel and Kittle having monstrous seasons. Just to put a little more context on some of these rushing numbers and throw in a name that I know that you want to hear in the pods from time to time. Last season, Justin Fields played 634 snaps, rushed for 420 yards. There is upside for these guys who have the extreme athleticism there as rushers.